So welcome to our first newsletter of the year. At Cor-Kinetic we'd like to wish you a very merry, happy and prosperous new year. What we're going to talk about this month is understanding our clients' movement better, and we think that's one of the most important things that you can do as a trainer. So this month's newsletter in the text part talks about the bubble or sphere of your client's movement. And when that bubble starts to shrink, when it starts to get smaller, what we tend to find is that our movement potential gets smaller, our injury potential can go up, those aches and those pains and those niggles start to increase, and generally people start to move worse. And if they move worse, they move less. And at Cor-Kinetic, it's all about getting people to move better and move more and achieve their goals. So what we're going to do is just show you a real quick hitter of an assessment. It's going to be in the transverse plane because that's kind of the most spherical of all the planes of movement, and one of those areas that we tend to kind of neglect as trainers. When we look at sport, when we look at our movement, we tend to move very, very much in the transverse plane. When we play golf, when we throw, when we kick, most of the action's in the transverse plane. In fact, a lot of walking is actually in the transverse plane, and it's one of these areas that we neglect. At Cor-Kinetic, we tend to do a lot of work with Premiership and Championship football clubs and helping them understand their players' sphere of movement better. And one of the assessments that we find works really well is understanding the hip or the groin area. So many people have reduced movement through the hip and ability to twist and turn, and that can lead to a lot of injuries. And a lot of sedentary people who tend to sit down a lot in their desk at work all day on computers, etc., they tend to kind of really compress the structures of the hip, both kind of neurological structures and more physical structures, such as the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons. And what we need to realise is we need to open these people up. But to start off, we actually need to assess how they need to open up. It's no point increasing someone's internal rotation if they actually need external rotation. So we at Cor-Kinetic, and specifically at our EMS course, our Elite Movement Specialist course, what we're trying to do is give you the skills and give you the techniques to be able to understand your client's movement better. And one of our favourite ones is this simple hip assessment. And again, we're looking at the transverse plane of motion, which is the rotational plane. And actually, if we look at the rotational plane of the hip, it's very, very much spherical. So what we're looking to do is assess that sphere of motion. So the first thing that we're going to do is put our feet nice and straight, and I'm going to put my foot out in front of me. And what I'm going to do first is look at the internal rotation of the hip. Now, obviously, there's two ends to the transverse plane. One would be internal rotation, one would be external rotation. And we want to assess both. So what we need to first be able to do is just decide which one we're going to do. So for me, we're going to go internal rotation first. So kind of we're going to be assessing what happens mostly in the kind of posterior hip capsule, the glute, the hamstring, all very transverse plane muscles around the hip. So what we're going to do is just simply put our foot forward, and we're going to create rotation around the hip. Now actually the real bone motion here between the pelvis and the femur is actually external rotation, but because the proximal bone is moving on the distal bone, the relative joint motion is actually internal rotation. So one of the things we also learn in the EMS is kind of the 5 ways that we can move a joint to create the same reaction and understand a little bit more about applied biomechanics. So what we're going to do is just rotate round and just see how far we get. So on my left side, I'll probably get to about 45 degrees. Now there's no point just saying, well, is that good or is that bad? We need to assess against the other side. So simply I'm going to do exactly the same thing and rotate round on the other side. Instantly we can see that's better. That the internal rotation of my left hip is definitely worse than on my right. So if I was to look at my sphere of movement, that my left side sphere would be definitely worse than my right. Now I can do the same thing with external rotation. So now I can move my proximal pelvis away from my distal femur and create external rotation in the joint. And again, that's kind of where I get to, probably about 135 degrees behind. If we looked at a neutral position here, that also would be about 45 degrees. So again, let's look at what happens on the right side in comparison. So as I rotate round, and we can actually see again, I tend to get a lot further on my right hip than my left hip. Now, any good assessment should really tell us what we need to do next. That's the point of an assessment. What do you need to do next? Well, for me, certainly I want to work on the internal and external rotation of my left hip. Simply, my bubble on my right side is a lot bigger than the bubble on my left. And you know, how's that going to affect me when I move out and go to lunge if I'm playing football? How does that affect my movement during gait when I step forward with my right leg? We have to look at these scenarios. We also can look at what happens when I'm on a single leg, and does that movement reduce even further? And that will kind of bring in a bit of a neurological aspect to it. How do I control and stabilise motion, that concept of motion and stability together? So if I put my leg up and create kind of an unstable environment that my left leg needs to stabilise against, do I increase or reduce my movement? And definitely I can feel that I reduce my movement. And we know that things like the hip capsules are very, very neurological tissue. So is there also a neurological as well as a structural element to the test that we're testing? So again, if I put my right leg up, we can see that that's a hell of a lot freer and I'm able to get a lot more motion through my right. So try that on your clients. Is their internal and external rotation worse on their left or worse on their right? Does that change when I go to a single leg? And how can we better understand our client's sphere of movement? I think that's really, really important. So, see you later from Cor-Kinetic. We hope to see you in one of our EMS courses soon. And I look forward to talking to you again in our next newsletter. Bye-bye.